I should have raised dogs. They're more loyal, they're more loving, and after 20 years, they die. These words were my mother's words to me pretty much at any time I had done any kind of vaguely disappointing thing. I think all of my siblings and I had heard it before at some point or another, but I don't know where my mother got that phrase from. I thought for many years that she was quoting some sort of movie or something like that, but I searched Google recently, and there was only one hit in all of the Google sphere with anything about this phrase, and it was only a part. I should have raised dogs. It was someone's poetry attributed to celebrating their father. For all of my mother's life, these are the words I remember from her most. More than I love you, more than I'm proud of you, more than anything else she told me about her childhood. I remember that my mother said she would rather have raised dogs. I'm not sure what my mother ever intended for us to take from that, other than maybe a dark joke about just what it was she expected from her family. It's good to recognize that what I'm about to talk about is a little bit of a theory rather than fact. Some of the facts I know is that my mother's mother was married to a man named Jacob Zeev, who had emigrated to the United States and was 22 years older than her at the time of their marriage, and Pearl Hamp would have been 16. I'm making the assumption that this was an arranged marriage because it was really common in Jewish families at that time. In fact, it was fairly common in non-Jewish families. So the odds of Pearl getting married in 1933 at age 16, having her first child at age 17, my mother, and then her second child at age 20, chances are she didn't handle it well, considering that there's a history of depression in the family, and they really didn't have a lot of the tools to deal with it at this time. My mother's description of her mother, my grandmother, getting pneumonia and going into the hospital while her father had abandoned them and her brother died after 3 months, was something that had been a continuing concern with my mother regarding abandonment issues and the way in which the family should behave, kind of for our whole lives. Now, of course, this doesn't define every aspect of my mother. She's a complex person like anyone else. The last thing is that I want these to be kind of informal. I'm just going to talk about this project as I'm writing it. In the end, my parents did not have the American dream, but they were the exact people that I always thought the American dream was built for. And I want to go through that as my family went through the events of 20th century America and experienced almost the inevitable decline of their ideals. This is my telling after having done years of research on this. I've become my family's genealogist to a degree. I've gathered pictures. I've taken so many different little trips in and around Brooklyn and various other places to verify many of the details that still remain unclear about our family. I have no idea why. It's just been very curious to me, and because so much of this history was always hidden. And that's the thing. I heard so much of this story time and again, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. But the problem, of course, is that my mother often lied to me, as she lied to herself. My mother was telling the story that she needed to remember. And that's not necessarily true history, but it's definitely something about what happened and why she did what she did and who she was. And funny enough, these are the things that I do still love about her. My mother was complicated. My grandmother was married at age 16 to a man 22 years older than her, a man named William Zeev. who had come over to the United States from Russia. I assume this was an arranged marriage because of some of the details around it, and that might have been typical at the time. So when William came over, he was speaking Yiddish as a first language. Pearl Hamp's mother's first language and father's first language was Yiddish, listed on all the various immigration forms, marriage certificates, and census forms that had been taken at the time. Yiddish, I'm just going to assume these were probably Jews. And it was something my mother had tried to keep secret for a large part of her life for reasons that we'll get to later, but let's just say that the notion of anti-Semitism in the 1930s was not only happening in Germany. It was very much a thing in America, and it was something my mother deeply feared in Brooklyn. When William arrived, he first settled into Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is a major center of Jewish populations within Brooklyn itself. He was a jeweler. They lived on Broadway at a place that no longer exists and is just a large 1960s-era apartment block I've been by. They had my mom in 1934, and then a few years later they had another child, William, who would have been my uncle had he survived past maybe 3.5 years. Now, he died of a congenital heart disease, according to some death certificates I managed to locate, when my mother was in her 70s. My mother had been angry, incredibly angry, at her father for her entire life over this, as she assumed that his actions were why her brother died. A lot happened to Pearl in the same space and time. Basically, she had the child in February. This was William in February of 1937. Her mother then died. This is Sally Lifshitz. She died in March of that year. It's the story my mother always told was that she then got pneumonia and was put into the hospital, and my mother and William were put into an orphanage. The most likely one is a Hebrew orphanage that's fairly famous that was operating in that area until the early 1950s. When people describe the past, especially as children, they often say how things weren't so bad. To be honest, they sound a little bit fun, but it's mostly because the story sounds fun. I think they sound terrible. But when she was at the orphanage, she was really young. This was a 3-year-old who was suddenly taken away from her mother, didn't know where her father was, or whatever other relatives that she might have known, and put into a completely unfamiliar orphanage. Now, to be fair, with the other options for children that age, considering the Great Depression, considering a large city like New York, the orphanage was probably a good thing, all things being equal. The most striking thing about this story for me is how many times my mother told me this. It was something that was on very regular, it was on repeat in a lot of ways in her own kind of telling of her history in the world. And she would talk about how she was not able to sleep when she was there, not because she was worried, but because they only had one toy to play with in the next day, and they had to choose just one thing, and then they had to race and chase the other kids to see who would get that toy and whichever, and she would think about it the whole night. Again, not crazy to think about for a 3-year-old to think that way. Absolutely makes sense. But you must remember that this is a woman in her 60s and her 70s that was describing this to me as if it was something that had happened to her the day before. My mother dealt with this sense of loss, betrayal, abandonment for her entire life. And if you had met her in the last years of her life, you might have thought that that's all that she ever was. But my mother was also one of the more brilliant, funny, darkly sarcastic, and quick-witted women I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And I hated my mother in the end, but I loved her all my life, and that wasn't always hard. So I'm going to tell her story, as best I'm able to. But in order to understand my mother's story, you need to know some of the background. And I'll get to that.